This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest, Co de Kloet, author of Frank & Co. Conversations with Frank Zappa, 1977 to 1993. Co de Kloet and Frank Zappa were friends for many years, and during that time, Co recorded nearly every conversation the two men had. They also corresponded frequently about life, music, politics, and much more besides. And this book offers a unique chronicle of their friendship, from their first meeting in 1977 to Zappa's death in 1993. Co is renowned as an expert on Zappa's music, but this book is about far more than that, and it's unlike any other collection of interviews. As his son Dweezil writes in his foreword, Frank was a reluctant and sometimes combative interviewee, yet his conversations with Co were open and wide-ranging. Through more than 2 decades of these discussions, Frank & Co. reveals a thoughtful, sensitive, and expansive Zappa, offering readers new insights into the life and career of one of the great masters of 20th-century American music. It also includes Co's favorite memories of Frank, as well as interviews with Zappa alumni Flo Eddie, Jimmy Carl Black, Pamela Zarubica, and Don van Vliet, a.k.a. Captain Beefheart. Co has shared some of his rare recordings with Frank Zappa and his former bandmates with the Booked on Rock podcast, and you'll hear them throughout this interview. Co de Kloet is a musician, composer, producer, and radio personality who works for Dutch public broadcaster NTR and the Conservatorium van Amsterdam. Known in the trade as the creative catalyst, he also runs his own media company, Ziva Sound. To hear a playlist of Frank Zappa, including the music discussed in this episode, head over to the show notes page. Co, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
This book really gives us an up-close look at Frank, which was not easy to do because Frank wasn't all that comfortable talking with journalists, yet there you were, good friends with him. You made a great connection with him. So let's start where it starts. When you were 18, it's 1977, and as you write in your book, your friends know you as the great Zappa ambassador.
I used to bore my fellow pupils at high school by talking and writing about Frank all the time. And I'd been a fan for years because I saw him way before I met him. I saw him years before that play live already. And so I had seen him in concert a few times before we actually met. And one of the things that his son Dweezil pointed out in the foreword that he wrote for my book is that, of course, one of my great advantages was that I'm not a journalist.
That was the connection that you made with Frank then. You approached it as not a journalist, but just as
because I'm not. I was then a fan and very interested in music, and knowing that I wanted to have a career in music / media, and so I was working on that. So that is what attracted me in his music also. And then, of course, I had through my father, who was a very important radio personality here in Holland. He had the first rock show in Dutch radio ever. Through him, I had the opportunity to meet Frank in Amsterdam. And then actually that was the beginning of it was then not really a friendship because I only met him once in one evening. But then the years later, it developed into something more than just saying hi. And so that moment in 77 was actually the start of my personal relationship with Frank.
Were you born and raised in Holland?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, I was born in this little village that I still live in. So I was born 300 yards down the road, and I've traveled around a lot, but I came back and I got a chance to buy my grandfather's farmhouse. So that's where I live.
How did you go about turning, because you had that dream of one day meeting Frank Zappa in person and interviewing him, and you turned that dream into a reality. How did that all happen?
It was extremely weird because I also described it in the book, but I'm more than happy to tell you because it's such a weird story. The first time I saw Frank live was in 1973 with the infamous band with people like Jean-Luc Ponty and George Duke and Ian and Ruth Underwood. So that was really, really something. And I was then 14, and I was already a fan. So for me to go to that concert was really like, wow. I mean, my whole musical world was upside down. And I definitely did want to meet him, but, what are you going to do? You can want that, but how are you going to make it into a reality? Well, then my father had arranged through a guy who also lived here in our village, and who was a promo guy for Warner Brothers, to have me present while Frank did some interviews in a hotel in Amsterdam, a very nice, chic hotel called the Pulitzer. And there was a lot of tension between Warner Brothers and Frank in those days, so things were a bit awkward now and then. So this guy named Jan Bult, he said, sit in the lobby, and I cannot guarantee anything, but if there's a chance for you to meet Zappa, we'll see what happens. Just stay here. So I was sitting in the lobby, and I had a very tiny photo camera that I borrowed from my mom, and a tiny tape recorder with me. And I was sitting in this lobby in this very expensive and nice looking hotel, and just, of course, I was nervous. I said, maybe I'm going to meet Frank, maybe not. You never know. So in walked a few guys, and I recognized two of them. I recognized Patrick O'Hearn, the bass player, and Terry Bozzio, the drummer. And I just said hi, and they said hi, and they were just looking at me like, another fan hanging around in the lobby, So they just went to the elevator, and that was it. Then two other guys came in, and they were looking really hip in my eyes. And one of them turned out to be Frank's monitor mixer called Coy Featherston. And I was talking to them, and they says, "Hey man, what's happening?" And I said, "Well, I explained that maybe I can meet Frank, and." Well, don't bet on it. It's very difficult and we're very hectic, blah, blah, blah. But I said, but can I do a short interview with you guys? And they said, sure. So I got to the hotel room, and I did a short interview with Coy Featherston about working for Zappa. So I already had something, this was for me great to have, being a real fan. And so then that was that. And they wanted to go out and get something to eat. So I went back to the lobby, and it was empty. In come three guys with really long curly hair, mustaches, beards, Mexican, Italian looking. And I was looking, which one is Frank Zappa? And I was just looking, and I said, no, it's not. Maybe they're in the crew or something, but Zappa's not one of them. So I was really getting confused and nervous, and on my own in that lobby. And then the door opens, the slide door opened, and this gentleman walks in with very tight, combed hair in a ponytail that I couldn't see, so I thought it was real short. And he had nice clothes and a very expensive jacket, and he was wearing a briefcase, so like an Italian businessman. Tiny mustache, and he did have a goatee. But the last year I saw Frank before that, in '76, he was looking really wild, curly hair all over the place and big mustache and everything. And here's this businessman. I thought, Jesus. And he looks at me, and I don't exactly remember how I felt, but I stuttered a bit, and I said to him the most stupid thing I could say: "Are you Frank Zappa?" And he says yes. And I said, Jesus. Elevator door opens, he goes in, he says bye-bye, and he's away. So I thought I blew it. Then he turned out he was going to do some interviews, and about 40 minutes later, the promo guy comes down. He says, "Now, you can come with me now." He's rounding up an interview. Just be there, and I'll ask if you can meet him. No guarantees. So I walk into the room, and there he is, sitting in that real Italian-looking way, and talking to some people, very nice, photographer taking shots. And I says, "Can I take a picture?" And so I took my first picture of Frank with my mother's camera while he was holding a bottle of whiskey. And then when the interviews were done, Jan Bult, the promo guy, goes to Frank and he says, "There's still some time, and this is a good friend of mine. His name is Co, and his father also, his name is also Co, and he's a important relation of us, blah, blah, blah. And Co would like to ask you a few questions because he's probably the biggest fan you have in Holland." And Frank looks at me and he says, "And you still had to ask if it was me when you saw me in the lobby?" And I didn't know what to say. And so I said like, And he says, you were just being careful, huh? I said, "That's it." So I sat down and I did an interview. and he was ever so nice. And he was, and of course I was still in high school, so it was maybe it was in his eyes a stupid interview, but he was very nice and cooperative. So I had my my interview and my photo.
And that was the beginning of a great relationship. What was it that drew you to Frank's music? What was the first Zappa song you heard?
Oh, that's very easy. The first song of the first album. Because what happened is that I was raised in a very musical environment because my father was also a producer. He was not an active producer as a musician like I am, but he did make a lot of musical-oriented programs. So in my house, there was always music, musicians, producers, Dutch famous guys, and also just music and art. And so I got interested in radio and music and I knew that in the future I wanted to combine those two. And then I was mainly listening to top 40 music, the American songbook type stuff my father used to like, Sinatra and stuff like that, Sarah Vaughan. And the current hits that my father would play in his radio shows. And I have always been a great admirer and also a player of Baroque music. So that's mainly was my diet, my musical diet. And then in the first grade of high school, a girl said to me, we were talking about music, and she said to me, my father has this album, and you should check it out because it's very weird. And it's called Freak Out by a group called the Mothers of Invention. I said, wait a minute, I've seen that in my father's collection. So I went home, 12, 13, maybe 12, I think 12. I went home and I got out, I found the album and I just put it on this was, by the way, the European version, which was a single album, not the double version.
Okay. With that same psychedelic cover.
Yes, it's exactly the same, only it didn't have a fold-out sleeve, and it was like a single album. And then I put on the needle on the record, and what a lot of people had experienced, because I talked to a lot of people about this, from that moment on, your whole musical universe has changed. And then to make matters worse, a few months later, or maybe even a few weeks later, my father brought home the soundtrack to 200 Motels. And then for me, it was clear that this was it for me. And then half a year later, I got to hear Trout Mass Replica by Captain Beefheart. And then I knew that my life would never be normal again.
That's what I love talking with music fans for this podcast. Authors, you don't get bigger fans than authors because they have a huge passion for the subject. So they all have that moment. We all have that moment that it's the life-changing moment when you hear a particular artist, particular album, or a song. You feel something so different than you would feel with any other song that you may have heard before that. And yeah, there's something powerful about that. It becomes part of your DNA from that moment on.
That's right. That's exactly what happened. And the thing is that what was so weird is that later I could analyze for myself what it was that I enjoyed so much. And because I felt it, but I couldn't really describe it for myself. It took me years and years to describe it. And that's something that is still with me when I listen to Frank or talk about him or meet people through him, which I still do. And that is, I would say, an unprecedented amount of honesty. The amount of honesty he puts in his music, in his compositions, but even in his approach to life is so devastatingly honest that that was a big inspiration for me and still is today.
And it's off the beaten path. It's not the norm. It's so different than anything else. Here in America, when you would hear a Zappa song on a rock station, it was so different from everything else. Avant-garde, however you want to call it. But like you say, honest, because there was certainly no intent to be a pop star. There was no intent to be putting singles on the radio and becoming a hit maker. It was just, this is what I'm going to do. What is it about? The songs are so different. The song titles, from the get-go, when you see the song title, Hungry Freak's Daddy, Who Are the Brain Police, you just know, wowie zowie. You know what you're going to get when you hear it.
Yes, and also of course, what I found very interesting when I started sort of studying Frank is that you could make a whole list of stuff that he did and give a description to that, like an author or a guitar player, band leader, businessman, filmmaker, etc., etc. But of course, number one on the list for him always was a composer. And I think that's what made him really, really special in the whole scene, especially in those days, that he approached the world from a compositional standpoint rather than trying to be popular or hip or whatever,
I always thought it was just so impressive that he was able to get songs on the radio too. That speaks a lot of just how good the music was. Didn't have the hooks, chorus, the usual things that would put it on the radio, but there it was. Joe's Garage used to get a lot of play here in New York. I can come up with probably a handful of songs that The Muffin Man was one that would get played. I always thought that was interesting and impressive that he was able to get that airplay.
Yes, and of course, and he also proved before he started the band, or joined the band rather, is that he already had written some stuff that you could see he could write a top 40 hit single if he wanted. He did write some stuff in the pre-Mother's days that was pretty commercial, but then again, he also wrote film scores, and he also wrote experimental music, if you want to call it that way. And that was, of course, because of his strange approach that he would listen to the radio and hear a lot of rhythm and blues and blues type stuff, and then developed a growing interest for contemporary classical music and folk music. And then, as he said many times in interviews, is that he said what he was going to do, like an alchemist, he was going to put those things together. And that was never done before. Let's face it. I mean, nobody has ever thought, let's take Edgar Varese, the most hardcore avant-garde orchestral music that you can get, and combine that with Johnny Guitar Watson. I mean, and he did it. So that formula was so unique to him. And he kept curious and he kept developing. And of course, later when he became famous and could work with anybody he wanted to work with, he could even expand his musical vocabulary.
Early on, I would think he had some issues with a record label. Record label execs aren't going to welcome that type of music, I would think. They want something that's going to appeal to the masses.
That's one of the things that he talks about in the book. I will tell you about the construction of the book later, because then you can understand, or the listeners can understand more, why I can fall back on certain things that Zappa said. But there's a great YouTube clip somewhere where he explains where it went sour in the music business. He said that when he started, the business was ran by older cigar smoking guys who didn't know what was happening, and they just thought, okay, let's try, just put this out and let's see if it makes money, and if it makes money you can do it again. That was their focus. But then when it became a big business, these people thought, well, maybe we should bring in people who know what's happening, who are experts on this. And then Frank said in that clip that I'm talking to, he says, the guy said, let's bring in a hippie. And the first hippie that they brought in, who first had to bring the mail around and then get coffee and then became an A&R manager. He says from that moment on, you had people in the executive suite who thought that they were creative geniuses, and that they knew what was happening and that they knew what was good for the public and stuff like that. And of course, for people like Zappa, those were not the most idealistic partners to talk to, because they were going to interfere, and that's still happening today. If you look at product managers, A&R managers, they have a certain responsibility to the guy who pays their salary, so they have to even pretend that they know what's happening and make all kind of decisions, and that's why they play it safe. So Frank explains in my book that a lot of the music that has been released, and of course he's been dead for almost 30 years, so we talk about the 80s and the beginning of the 90s and the 70s, is that you see that there's a big tendency that if somebody new is going to be released, he has at least to look for 50% like something that is already successful. So, and through that procedure, things get to be more and more alike, and And I remember now that I talked to you, Eric, that about 10 years ago, there was a European bureau that did all kind of investigations and all kind of tests with parameters. And in popular music, they said that popular music gets more and more and more uniformed as time goes by. It sounds the same, it looks the same, it has to be the same. Because then you might be successful if you are just like the other successful group, but just a little different.
Makes me think of that.
So
the Pink Floyd song from 75, Have a Cigar. Come in here, dear boy, have a cigar. You're going to go far. You're going to fly. You're never going to die. I wonder what Roger Waters thought of Frank Zappa. I always wondered. I would think he had an appreciation for Frank's music.
Well, one of the things that escaped on the social media, the audio was already known, but there's now this jam in Belgium where Frank plays with Pink Floyd.
Okay, what year would this be?
69.
So that's during the Syd Barrett years. Interesting. Yep. Well, there is one song I want to ask you about specifically, which is Packard Goose. He wrote this song about rock and roll journalists. And there was a great quote from Frank during a 1979 press conference when he was asked about the song. Can you share this story?
It's getting to be an infamous press conference. Frank was staying in the most expensive hotel in Amsterdam called the Amstel Hotel, where all the presidents stay, and where Frank Sinatra would stay. It's the hotel. But earlier that afternoon, there was a press conference in another hotel called the Okura, which was run by a Japanese company. Beautiful hotel with the most famous sushi bar in the basement. And on the top floor, there was this big room, and all these journalists were there. They were in half a circle. And since I was the only guy there for radio, I was the one with a professional tape recorder. So I was sitting next to Frank. So I was sitting next to Frank and see this half circle of journalists all drinking and eating olives and stuff like that. And then Frank came in and they said, "Hey, Frank, what would you like to drink?" So they had whiskey, they had cognac, they had beer, they had wine, and and so Frank says, "I want a cup of coffee," and there was no coffee, so I had to rush down to get him coffee. And in my book, I say so much for research, because everybody who knows that Frank just drinks coffee. And then the press conference was really, really, how do you call it, awkward, because there would be long silences. Frank would just stare. Just look at them, and then somebody would ask a question, and then one guy, Frank, of course, one of Frank's great singers was a gentleman called Napoleon Murphy Brock, who's still a great friend of mine, and but he was not in the band, and Frank had a new singer called Ike Willis, and Ike sang all of the things from the albums that Napoleon used to sing, and this journalist begins to badmouth Ike, like, where's Napoleon? And why do you have this guy singing his part? This was a great singer. He's the Joe's Garage vocalist. And he's a great singer. And he was handpicked and auditioned by Frank, So who do you think you are you can say it's not my taste, but he was just attacking Frank for even paying the guy a salary, So the situation was very, very awkward. And then I thought I will lighten the mood a bit. And I said to him, because I saw that he was pissed off. And Joe's Garage had just been released. And of course, Packard Goose was on there. And I said, trying to look a bit innocent or naive, I said, "Isn't it true?" Because I knew. I said, "Isn't it so that you recently wrote a song about rock and roll journalists?"
Nice.
And
nice move.
And I just twinkle in his eyes, and he says yes. And the famous quote that he said, I'm paraphrasing, is that rock and roll journalism is people who can't write talking to people who can't talk, writing articles for people who can't read. So that was his take on journalism. And then one of the guys said, like so many artists did. And Frank says, what? He said, well, like so many artists have written songs about rock and roll journalists. And that was it for Frank. And then I describe it in my book. If I can tell you what Frank if you want to hear it literally,
Sure.
I can get the book here and say, because I described that press conference, and later we used to make fun of it and remember it, and it had a very, very strange aftermath because something happened during it. And
while you look that up, let's get to some of the lyrics in the song. It's okay to use expletives here, by the way. All them rock and roll writers is the worst kind of sleaze. Fuck all them writers with a pen in their hand. I will be more specific so they might understand. They can all kiss my ass, but because it's so grand, they best just stay away.
What if I can read 5 lines from the book?
Sure.
I said, I read, one of the awkward silences was broken by a rather grim interaction between Frank and one of the journalists who was making a big deal out of the fact that Frank's new vocalist, singer Ike Willis, was taking over the parts originally sung on the album by Napoleon Murphy Brock. The general argument was that, in the journalist's eyes, Willis was a poor imitation of Brock. After Frank put him down sternly and defended Willis, it seemed the perfect moment to ask about Zappa's song, Packard Goose. So I say, is it true you made a song about rock and roll journalists? Frank, yeah, journalist, like so many other rock and roll stars. Frank says, huh? Journalist, like so many other rock and roll stars. Frank, well, it's a good thing to do, you know. It's nice to commemorate them, because the only way a rock and roll journalist has of being famous is to dress weird, form a group himself or herself. It's pretty difficult to distinguish yourself with a typewriter, you know. So it's better just to be an asshole and wait for a group to write a song about you. And then I say, understandably, the silences grew longer and more awkward after that.
If any, what effect did it have on him? Were the repercussions coming from that? Did the media treat him unfairly, even more so after that? I think of sports where an athlete is kind of grumpy with the media, and it takes them a long time to get into the Hall of Fame because the sports writers had it out for them.
I used to read some articles that you could definitely feel that the journalist was trying to get even, you know, which is unfair because and that's why Frank told me once in the beginning of the 80s that he was going to stop doing interviews with the written press. He says, because they just twist my words around. And but the weird thing that happened then, and that was for me a step forward in my relationship with Frank, definitely a step forward, is that the silences grew longer, and you know, and most of them were journalists from newspapers. And I had this big Nagra tape recorder with me, and I was sitting next to him. And then when one of those awkward silences was occurring, he looks at me a bit, how do you call it? Not mad, but a bit firm, like direct. And he says, why don't you ask any questions? Because he knew that I knew what I was talking about. And then I probably got some sort of an adrenaline boost or whatever. And I said, I'll tell you. I said, here's the deal. I said, if I'm going to ask you questions, they might be good questions, and you're going to give me good answers, you know. But this is for a radio show that will air in 2 weeks. Now, as soon as I ask you a question and you give me a good reply, these people are going to write it down and publish it tomorrow. So first of all, it will be my question and your answer. I'm not getting paid for this, and you're not getting paid for this. They are getting paid, and they take the credit for the question and the answer in their publication. And in a week's time, my radio boss will say, this is old news. I already read it in a newspaper. And Frank was just looking at me like, yeah. He says, you know something? Why don't you come to my hotel tonight and we'll do a one-on-one interview. And I'm going to play you some new music. Be in my hotel at 8. And I said, okay, can I bring a friend? He says, sure. And then I went to the Amstel Hotel. I'd never been in the Amstel Hotel because I think it's about $2,000 a night. So, and I spent the whole evening there, and he had this big ghetto blaster with him, and he was playing me tapes that I've never heard before from the archive and new stuff and blah, blah, blah. And he was ever so nice. And my friend Jos was with me, and we could take pictures, and we had coffee and blah, blah, blah. Then for me, a magical thing happened. One of the many that I have been able to experience with Zappa. He got out a little notebook from the hotel and he wrote down his address. And he says, "Here, this is for you. Whenever you're in Los Angeles, come over. We're going to have coffee." So I left the hotel. So I had my one-on-one interview, my pictures, and a personal invitation to visit the house, And this was only 2 years after I met him. So that was really special.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. You shared some of your recordings with the podcast. There's a clip from 1979 where Frank talks about the build-up to the next night's show.
Well, the structure of this show is basically vocals. There's very little talking to the audience. Mm-hmm. There's very little instrumental music. Mm-hmm. Just the only solos in the main part of the show are the guitar solos that I play, and then one solo that Denny plays. Yeah. And other than that, it's all vocals. Mm-hmm. And it's mostly songs that people are familiar with. If they know the albums, then they'll know these songs.
You asked him about David Bowie. Can you set this one up for us? He wasn't a big Bowie fan, right?
Well, no, he was always playing that down a bit. Like he said, I've heard him on the radio and I've seen him live once, and because I used to know a lot of people who loved Bowie and Zappa. So I said, "Is there any connection, do you think?" So maybe not the best question I ever asked, but I just wanted to know.
Did he become a fan at any point down the line? Because there are many versions of David Bowie.
Well, I don't know. It's always very clear, because having had the privilege of being as Terry Bozzio calls it, a footnote in the Zappa history. I mean, I never tried to pretend to think for him or to speculate on something he might have said or might have thought, because why would I? I have enough to tell firsthand. But of course, there is an infamous meeting with him and Bowie that Adrian Belew likes to tell, because as you may know, is that when Adrian Belew was in the band, Bowie invited Belew to be in his band.
He went directly to work for Bowie as soon as our tour was done, because Bowie offered him twice as much money. Yeah. It's a simple American arithmetic.
And that's when Bowie started talking to Frank about that subject. The infamous quote is that all Frank said back to him was, "Fuck you, Captain Tom."
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there was a deep mutual love. And I double-checked this. I did a project once with Brian Eno, and I double-checked if this story was true. And he said, yeah.
Dweezil's talked about how Frank loved playing around with instruments and equipment and making it work for him in the way he played. And because he rarely used anything stock, it's difficult to duplicate his tones. And there are a couple of albums, The Apostrophe and Overnight Sensation, where there is, as Dweezil called it, a nasty guitar tone. This came thanks to Frank's Pignose amplifier. This is another clip we have from that same 79 interview where he's talking about the Pignose Amp and its use on a song from, I believe it's the Zoot Allures album.
Torture Never Stops.
Yeah, okay. Can you give us some background on this amp?
It's a tiny amp, and he put it in a certain room with a certain miking, and then he would get that really, really edgy sound to it. And then later, George Duke told me that it was his Pignose, and he never got it back from Frank.
What I did on the Torture was I took the Pignose and I put it in the echo chamber, the live echo chamber in the studio, and sent the signal through the echo send directly into the Pignose, and then had two microphones in the echo chamber to pick it up.
Frank was looking for a specific sound, a specific tone. You hear that a lot with guitarists. They're always chasing that tone. Did he get to that point where he had that tone that he was happy with, that he said, "This is it. This is what I was looking for"?
Yeah. And of course, he did that with his own guitar sound, but he did it with sound on a larger scale also, His sound was so... That's also one of the things that for me links him to great composers and great thinkers in music, like, for instance, Stockhausen or Edgar Varese, or some great jazz players, is that their connection and their passion with the world of sound is so heavy, Like Edgar Varese would say that music is organized sound, and So Frank, from the start, he was always looking for sounds, you know.
Can we see, I'm almost running out of tape before it is too late. Can you give a final message to your regular listeners, what they can expect, what they cannot expect? And
well, one thing that I'm working on now that may surprise everybody is a guitar album that's going to be available by mail order only.
Yeah, any month.
Well, all over the world. It's called Shut Up and Play Your Guitar. And all it is guitar solos. You know, all those tapes from all over the world? Mm-hmm. Well, I'm throwing the songs away and just keeping the guitar solos. And it's one guitar solo after another. If you want to hear me play the guitar.
Is it serious with you, John?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
so that's respond for the demand of your guitar playing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can, you can get it through the mail.
It's a very good idea.
Yeah.
On not on a certain label.
No, I'll probably put it on NCP. Stands for No Commercial Potential.
I always got the feeling, too, that everything around him was a potential instrument. Just the rhythm of a printer. He would say, you know what, I could use that for something. Is that accurate?
I would agree. I don't know if he would formulate it like that himself, but that's definitely something, of course, that is influenced his art, as did events or just things that happened in ordinary life, or things that he saw and witnessed, or things that he heard from people. He would turn that into a song or into a, as he called it, social commentary. That's why he was so, in his own way, so engaged, and that could be very, very philosophical, or it could just be funny. I mean, Valley Girl. I mean, it's like a social commentary on something that happened in the Valley. It was not even supposed to be a hit, and same goes for a song like Jewish Princess, or of course you had the whole fantasy thing that he did, like songs like Billy the Mountain, or social commentary on the first album about the Watts riots in LA, trouble coming every day. He would comment on stuff, and he would be very, very open. That's why people who would like to keep people ignorant or stupid or whatever hated him so much, because he would be out in the open and just say what was on his mind, and he would make no it was just for him getting the message across. That's it. That's why he was one of the people, together with Dee Schneider and John Denver, during the PMRC testimonies, the hearings. Those three guys were standing up for the whole industry and say, we won't be censored.
Fearless.
Yeah.
He began the 1980s with a brand new band. He hooked you up with an Access All Area Pass for the tour, and you got to see the band during soundcheck. And you write, watching this band rehearse was better than drugs. Is there a particular era or lineup of Zappa that you prefer most?
No, that's too hard to say, because, every band had its charm. The band with Steve Vai was so virtuoso, and so, they could play anything. And then, of course, the later band, the last band, for instance, from 1988, it was really Frank and his orchestra, And in earlier days, Frank was more and more part of the band himself. And, of course, after the accident that he had in London, when he had to restart his career after the Turtle period, I think with the Turtles, he was really one of the band members. He was the boss. It was his music, and he was the boss. But the way they behaved and the way they would hang, he was really part of the band. Before that, it was not so much so. With the Old Mothers, he was also more separate from the band. With Flo and Eddie, he was very involved. Then he had the accident. He went into the jazz thing, so it was more like large ensembles that would play his music. And then from 80 actually, it was more the bands that really did what he wanted to do. And then he got great people like Steve Vai and David Logeman, Tommy Mars, Vinnie Colaiuta, so he could just cherry pick in that whole big pond of great musicians and design every band to what he wanted to do in that era. You can see, for instance, that this is purely my personal opinion, that the 84 band with Ike Willis and Ray White, and I don't know, I can't remember if Ike was in it, but Ray White was in there. Napoleon was for a short time. It was really, of course, Ike was in there. There was really a reaction to the fact that he had been working in the classical music era for months and months and months and months. And he was so fed up with the logistics and the whole attitude of the classical world that he just wanted to go out and have a boogie-oriented band. He phoned me up once and he says, I'm going to have a boogie band. Of course, it was a very Zappa band with complicated stuff, but that was really rocking, you know? So, and then the 88 band was just like a big review of all the stuff that he did, with a lot of new surprises, new versions of older songs, covers, which was an unprecedented amount of covers in any Zappa concert. Like he did I'm the Walrus, he did Stairway to Heaven, the Bolero, Whipping Post, and of course that famous Beatles medley where he changed the words about the whole Jimmy Swaggart thing and stuff like that. But and he had a big horn section, so that was really like a mini orchestra. And Frank.
Who were his influences as far as popular bands and artists? You just mentioned all those songs that he covered. Was he a fan of Zeppelin, the Beatles, Almonds?
Well, those things are pretty well documented in the interviews that he did. Is that he liked some of the Beatles songs, and of course he worked with two of them, and obviously he was very influenced by rhythm and blues. People like Johnny Guitar Watson. He really liked Wes Montgomery, Clarence Gatemouth Brown, Howlin' Wolf, stuff like that, and he often said that he wasn't really a big pop music consumer.
Was he a fan of the progressive rock bands? Yes. Tull?
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. He liked them. And of course he knew what was happening because he was so, for those people also, he was so important, like bands like King Crimson. And I know that he was pretty taken by a band that we had here in Europe called The Nice. He really liked those.
The Nice, yeah.
Yeah.
Now that was with, is that Keith Emerson's band?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he listened to a lot of contemporary classical music.
I want to go back to his lyrics and the messages in his songs or the themes of his songs. And one of the songs he played on that 1980 tour was Charlie's Enormous Mouth. Another clip you shared is of Frank talking about how the crowd misunderstood the song's meaning. Can you talk about this one? What was it that they misunderstood?
Well, he told me that the audience always reacted when he said the word nose, maybe because of the size of his own nose, but he said they just don't go for the message, you know?
Yeah, but see, it doesn't really do any good, because when we play that song in the United States, as soon as we say the word nose, half the people in the audience start cheering. They don't listen to the words because they think that it's, you know...
And of course, that was always something which was very important to me, that Frank was so openly against the use of drugs, because I grew up in the part of Holland where all the radio stations are and all the studios. So drugs in relation to media and music was a big thing here. So a lot of people in my peer group were blowing or snorting coke or stuff like that, and it was really hip to do. You really belonged to the group if you participated in that. And I was thankful that I was a Frank Zappa fan, because for me it was a hip thing not to do that. So what sometimes people absolutely do not believe is that even though growing up here, going to the conservatory here, working in studios here, and being there all the time, I never used any drugs, not counting wine.
Frustrating though when artists write a song and the message isn't connecting with the fans, they're not understanding it. I would think that did that frustrate Frank a lot?
I don't think so.
He didn't care.
Well, he always said it's either you get it or you don't. I mean, he said that he made his art primarily to hear it himself, and then he was very pleased if other people liked it as well. What
would really piss Frank off, and what, if anything, could make him laugh or smile?
Well, I only can talk from personal experience that he liked the absurdity of things. So I gave him some stuff as present. I would bring stuff that he was really surprised about, and then that would enjoy him. That would make him smile. Or if I asked really weird questions, that would make him smile. And like in the supplement show that was also partly released as a commercial cassette, I start talking about figures appearing in his songs and ask them where they are now and what they're doing. And then I said the Muffin Man, and I said Billy the Mountain, and stuff like that. And they he wrote a song once called Evelyn, a Modified Dog, which was about an echidna. So he would be amused to respond to that in a certain way when we were talking, because if we had just had a whole segment talking about the Gulf War, it would be nice to lighten the mood a bit and talk about where Billy the Mountain is these days, you know. Fortunately, I never pissed him off, and I always had a very nice support also in my work. He would also always ask, how's your work going? How's your program? How's your music? And if I did something with him, he would give me exclusive audio, or he would just send me stuff, and he would sometimes ask me to do things for him. And that's when I learned that if you promise to do something for him, then you better not fuck up, you know, you because then you're out. And don't take advantage of him. That's always something that I have always been very careful about, not to try to sneak in and do something for your own profit or your own fame or whatever, you know. And then because then he could get really mean. I've seen him get really mean to people, even when I was present, who were just trying to get something from him, and it just didn't feel right, you know. And then he could be really tough.
His radar was sharp with that. He knew if somebody was taking advantage of him.
Yeah. Not always in time, but most of the time, yes.
Yeah. We're talking with Kloet, author of the brand new book, Frank & Co., Conversations with Frank Zappa, 1977 to 1993. Is there a part of Frank Zappa that people would be surprised to hear about? Is there a part of his personality that surprised you?
Yes. Well, two things, actually. I only found out later, after having known him already for quite some time, how extremely fond he was of animals. That was just something I didn't know. So I found out later that was the case. And he was very kind, very taken with animals and their well-being. So that was very nice.
Did he have a lot of pets?
And yeah, I had dogs and cats, and the echidna that he describes in that song Evelyn. That was something that they had a plaque in the zoo because they paid for all the food and stuff. So yeah, he had dogs and cats, and so that was a very nice side of him. And one of the things that I also described that in the book is that, you know, he's often regarded as a genius and as a genius composer and genius this and genius that. And what I also liked about him is that he had an extremely childish side to him. And in the book, there's one example of that. You know, he had a bodyguard who, well, unfortunately also passed away, but I had a great time with this gentleman. His name was John Smothers, and he was referred to as Don. Frank wrote a song for him on the Joe's Garage album called Don Work for Judah, because he had a very weird way of speaking English. And he was also from Baltimore, just like Frank. Since 1982, I've been very close friends and still am with his then secretary, a beautiful, fantastic lady called Susan Rubio, who worked for Frank as a personal secretary assistant. And later she went to work for Johnny Carson. Susan was very, I wouldn't say shyish, but she was very nice. She was a very nice, polite girl, not like some of the other girls in the Frank Zappa household. So she was very nice, and she was a little, I wouldn't say prudish, but she wasn't overly erotically, sexually active in public, if you know what I'm saying. She was nice, and she was decent. And something had happened, and John Smothers was staying at the Zappa house for security reasons. Something had happened. Maybe it had to do with, I don't know. Something had happened, and Frank wanted him in the house. And Susan had this little office and in the house, and she would come in, collect the mail, get the mail, and go to her office, sit down, and select the mail and do her stuff and start up everything. And there was a beautiful summer's day, and she was wearing a tiny skirt. And she comes into her office, fixes things, and she sits down, and she feels something between her legs. So she's a bit scared, or she says, "What is this?" And so she stands up, and looking up on her chair is a gas mask. And she thinks, "What the fuck is this?" And am I sitting on a gas mask face, And then while she's being puzzled about all this, she hears giggling. And she looks around, and she sees around the corner from the door post, she sees the huge John Smothers and Frank, like little schoolboys, laughing. And that's why on the back of the book,
there's the gas mask.
That's the one, because she gave it to me. I told Frank, because you know that the whole Zappa family, when he was a kid, they all had their gas masks because his father was working at the Edwards Air Force Base or something. So if there's a problem, they had to have a gas mask. So those were Frank's toys, basically. So, and I'm not a huge collector, like a stamp collector or anything. I got all the Zappa I need, but I don't collect 10 versions of one cover or something. I don't do that stuff. But the gas mask is something that I really keep as a souvenir from those days.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Frank clearly marched to the beat of his own drum. He was not one to conform to the norm. He didn't care about fitting in with the popular crowd. In fact, he seemed to enjoy messing with the minds of the masses. Where do you think all that came from? Did he talk about his childhood or his parents a lot? He did move around quite a bit, right? He's from Baltimore, but I think his dad was a chemist, mathematician, also worked in the defense industry, so he moved around a lot.
Yeah, well, he had various jobs, and I think one of the reasons they went to California was because of the weather. And Frank had quite some addresses when he was a young kid, and I didn't talk to him about that a lot because that was already in books. And to go back to earlier part of our talk is that since I was not a journalist, I would not prepare my conversations with Frank. I just would go in and just start talking and just checking out what was on his mind. Because I knew that he hated repeated questions, those questions that he had already heard so many times before. And I always found it interesting that since we all knew so much about him already, because he's very, very well documented in other books and documentaries and whatnot, with that knowledge to hear him talk about current affairs. And that's what was my thing was. So that's why I don't say interviews with Zappa, but conversations. I wouldn't have a prepared list of questions. I need to ask this, and then I'm done. I would start talking, or have him start talking, and then I would check something for a radio program. I would check who is in the band, when is the new album coming out, stuff like that. But then, as soon as possible, and I still do that in the interviews that I do with artists I get to speak with, just try to have them speak about something that's on their mind, because then you feel more of their passion and more of their personality, I think. And that's why the book sometimes it's not a music book per se, it's about a lot of other things also, like politics or the political situation or the president or the Gulf War, or how he records, of course, about technical stuff that has to do with music, but not so much try to. I think, and you see that happen a lot in interviews. I think is that within the type of question a journalist asks, he already indicates actually what he wants the answer to be. And I do it the other way around. I don't have a journalistic training at all. I just am interested in people and interested in the music, and that's why I always had nice moments doing the interviews. They weren't always great interviews, but I mean, they were always encounters with a personality, and that's why I enjoy doing. And so if somebody gets bored, then you won't get a good interview or a good talk. I interviewed some legends And I've always tried to be faithful to that attitude. Just talk to them about something that I wanted to genuinely to know. I really want to know this. Why do you do it like this? And then they start talking, and you get a communication going. I even had that with Ray Charles, and he has been interviewed 100,000 times, and I had to interview him for television. I only had a few minutes. So I said, what am I going to do? So
if only more journalists realize that that is the way to go about it, rather than asking questions and pressing them on certain things, just talk to them. And eventually things will come out that are going to be interesting, sometimes fascinating. If they don't want to talk about it, they're not going to talk about it, no matter how many times you try. And the only way to go about it is to just genuinely care about this person enough, respect this person enough to just talk to them and see what comes out. Those are always the best interviewers.
I would make one exception, and that's for politicians, because that's a different agenda, If you know a politician knows something and you want it out of him, you can do your tricks. But I hate it, for instance, when people clearly indicate that if something tragic has happened in their life and they indicate, I don't want to talk about this, that some journalists will try to sneak in and get them talking about it anyhow, and they don't want to do it. So my question is then, why try? Why try to do that? You'll embarrass a person, or you'll make somebody sad, or...
Well, think about it. I know when I went to journalism school, the key to journalism, or the importance of journalism, at least back in the day, and it's certainly changed a lot over the years, but it was to keep our politicians honest, make sure they're transparent. So it is important, like you say, to have that different approach. With an artist, you don't need them to be transparent and honest. They don't owe us anything. Politicians are the ones we put our trust in for our own livelihood, our health plan, our future, our children, our elder parents. So there's a huge difference there. And I never understood that with artists, actors, musicians, unless that musician or actor wants to start talking politics, that's different. But just to say, I want to know what you were like as a kid, and were you ever abused as a child? Those strange questions that people would get. Makes no sense. As you know, I told you before we started recording, I'm a huge Stevie Vai fan, and I did discover him through his time with David Lee Roth, and later find out he worked with Frank. He joined Frank's band around 1980. This is another lifelong friendship that had a tremendous impact on you. Can you talk about Steve and your friendship with him?
Yes, of course. I first met him very briefly when he played in Holland for the first time with Frank. And then in that period, Frank's secretary was staying at my house. And this was when Frank was in Europe, and that he found out that he had a hit going on in the US with Valley Girl. And so Susan and I went to the show and went backstage, and I met the guys and met Steve, and so we knew who we were. We knew from each other who we were, and this was '82. And then he left the band, and I stayed in touch with Frank, obviously. And then in late '84, I think, '85. I find out that Steve was going to make a vinyl album, and I had my friend Menno, who's the producer of my book and my best friend here in Holland. Menno and I had a little production company called Siesta Productions, and we got in touch with Steve and said, how about us importing that album in Holland? And so, because I had some friends with music magazines, so we shipped in a whole bunch of those vinyl albums and the guitar lessons and photos that he did and scores, lead sheets. And we started selling those. And we would buy them from Steve and sell them. And so that was actually nice, because I still meet people who said, yeah, I bought my first flexible album from you. And so that was fun. So we and I can show you this, and the listeners will have to believe us, but I just recently found that Steve was represented by Laurel Fishman, who is a very famous person in the Zappa world. And I just found in my archive the original contract for us importing Flexible. Where she says that we can be the distributor and that we get so much % off and blah blah blah, and she says you may refer to yourselves as official distributors of Steve Vai merchandise, but not exclusive, okay? And so this was my first contract with Steve Vai from 1985.
Just on regular notebook paper, handwritten.
Yeah, it's a Laurel Fishman note.
You got to get that laminated.
And then so we stayed vaguely in touch. And then in the late 90s, I had an idea to do I was the chief editor of a 4-hour program on the classical station, and we did all these weird stuff. And I wanted to make a portrait about Vai. So I created a program called The Missing Link Between Contemporary Music and the Rock and Roll Guitar Solo. And that was all about Steve Vai. And so we met and we started working on it. And he says, why don't you come to America during my tour and see if you can have a budget from the radio station, and we'll do an interview while I'm on the road. And I still remember, because another good friend I have from the Zappa days is Mike Keneally. And Mike was then in Steve's band. And so I went to Sacramento. They did a G3 tour. Robert Fripp solo was opening for them. So I spent the whole day with Steve in his hotel, and later that night I would go to the show, and the next day I would fly back to Holland. We had done the interview, and I said to him, you've done so much and you're so famous and blah, blah, blah. Do you still have dreams? Things that you really, really need to do in your life? And he immediately says, yes, I want to work with an orchestra. And then in some sort of naive reaction, he says, okay, I'll fix that. And then he said, what do you mean? I says, well, let's talk about it. Maybe I have an idea. And that led to, I'm making a big leap now, that led into the first production we did in 2002, I think it was, with the Metropole Orchestra in Holland. And that was a phenomenal success. And then such a big success that 2 years later we did it again and had it videotaped for television. And then he released it as a DVD called String Theories or Sound Theories. And some clips on the internet of Vai and the Metropole are watched 40, 50 million times. You know, it was incredible combination. And then after that, I hooked him up with a symphony orchestra in Holland. And in the meantime, I recorded some of his shows in Holland with the band. And so we had this orchestra thing going, and then the classical orchestra thing going. That was a huge success. And then we just became really close friends. And he's a friend of mine. You know, I have 2 young children, and they refer to him as Uncle Steve. And our wives get along really well, and we are just very, very close friends. And we are now heading for a new adventure to do all the orchestra pieces as studio productions. And we just got along, and we found out something, and that's really magical. When we did the second run of the Metropole, I was backstage with him, and we were talking about the past. And of course, obviously, we talk a lot about Frank. And we found out that Frank had sort of predicted that we would work together one day. And of course, the funny thing is that the first thing that we really did together was after Frank passed away. So we could never feed back on him. So that was a big shame, but we were just baffled. He told you too? So we're great friends. And I like I wrote in the book, I have a few cooperations / friendships I have Frank to thank for, which are really special for me. Napoleon Murphy Brock, Terry Bozzio, Mike Keneally, Terry, Mike, George Duke, very important for me.
I asked you before we started recording, is Stevie Vai as nice as he is in interviews? And you said, absolutely.
You said, is he as nice as he said? And I said, no, he's nicer.
Nicer. That's right. He really just seems like a great guy, just humble and respectful, never has a bad thing to say about anyone or anything. He's so appreciative of his career. His David Lee Roth years, he says he is forever grateful to Dave.
Yeah.
Actually, before I get into that, though, so he was 18 when he joined Zappa's band. How did Frank discover him? And by the way, does he prefer Stevie or Steve?
Steve.
Yeah, okay, Steve. How does Frank discover Steve Vai?
I think he does.
Yeah.
Well, he calls me Koji.
Koji.
Yeah. Hey, Koji. So then I say Stevie.
Yeah, so how did Frank discover Steve? Where? How? Did he hear about him? How'd that all happen?
Steve sent him a transcript of the Black Page and a tape of him playing it on a guitar. And Frank was so baffled by it that he wanted him in the band immediately. But then he found out how old he was. So he was way too young to go on a world tour.
18, so right? 18 years old.
Yeah. And so Frank put him on a job to transcribe solos, which turned into the Frank Zappa guitar book. And so Steve was just scribbling away all these solos and all the Vinnie Colaiuta parts. And then in 80, from 80, he was then 20. He joined the band.
There was an interview back in 2012 where Steve was asked if Frank Zappa ever talked about Steve's work with David Lee Roth and if it was ever discussed. He said, no, I never heard Frank comment on my work with Dave, but he did say that I should invite Dave over his studio sometime, but that never happened. But he did say the first time Steve ever met Edward Van Halen was back in the 80s when he was in Frank's band. Edward was a big Frank fan, as we know, and Steve met Edward at a club. He found out Steve was with Frank, gave him his phone number and said, if you ever want to meet Frank, I'm sure he would be interested in seeing you. And Edward called him, Steve, the next day and went up to the house and they all jammed. Did Frank ever talk about his relationship with Edward?
Not to me.
No, because they were very close. And Eddie was really good to Dweezil. I'm sure you know those stories. Yeah,
of course, yeah.
Stevie had, there was something that Stevie saw in Frank Zappa that I think he saw in Dave too. They're not middle of the road. There was something interesting about them that they like to take chances, do things differently, little mysterious, kind of an enigma. And I think Stevie was really intrigued with that, right?
Definitely. And you see the cooperations that Steve has with people are often pretty intense, be it with the classical conductor that we work with now, be it with Devin Townsend. It's always very, very intense because Steve, everything he does, that's why I like him so much. It's all very real and very intense and very emotional and like Frank, honest. And what Steve has developed, that's why I like him so much also as a composer. He has developed his own language. And, I love electric guitar. I cannot play it. I cannot play one note. My son Fabian, he's now 9, and he's taking guitar lessons, and he's playing on one of Steve's guitars, and he just likes to do that. I'm just baffled how he does it, the chords and everything. But I am involved in the guitar world, and have been for a very, very long time because in my radio shows I devote a lot of time to great guitar players and had the chance to work with them. People like John Scofield and Vernon Reed, Mike and Neely. You name them, and I've done great recordings with them. So I love the instrument, but I think that in that whole army, that whole population of fantastic guitar players, Steve stands out for me because he combines it with a very strong own compositional identity. That's why I can write for orchestra so well. Often when guitar players are going to play with orchestras, especially if it's like orchestras playing the big hits of certain bands, it's always sort of artificial. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, let's do something hip. Let's do something with an electric guitar. But Steve is all genuine. It can only be that sound, that way of doing it. It's not a gimmick. It's not like trying to be different for different sake. It's all very intense and real. And what I found out when I made that remark in the late 90s about working with orchestras, and I'll fix it for you, I then did not know that in his Berkeley days he had already written orchestra pieces. So those were all recorded and documented, and now we're going to do it again.
One of my favorite tracks he did with Dave was Damn Good. And he said that was a solo track. It was intended to be a solo track, and then it became a David Lee Roth track. I'm so glad I got the chance to see Stevie. Steve Vai came to Toad's place in New Haven, Connecticut, and he's a showman. Came out, all the lights were out, dark, right? And you hear the crowd go nuts because you can hear the band kicking in, the drum. And he comes out with the headlamp. He's going from left to right, and everybody's going nuts. His family was up in the top. His wife and I can't remember if it was his daughter or something, but yeah, he's just a great showman.
Can I tell you a personal story about that one?
Oh yeah.
One day I was in Germany with him. It was a medium-sized club, packed with German Steve Vai fans, and really hardcore, really heavy crowd. But I'd been with Steve all afternoon in his tour bus, and we had something to eat. I can't remember how we spent the day exactly, but he was wearing like old jeans and a black T-shirt, and it was warm. I don't know exactly what year it was. It must have been around 2000 or so. I don't know. And so we were just having fun, and I was there with my then girlfriend, and so it was late 90s, I think. So he was just like a regular guy with jeans on and a black T-shirt. So he said, "I got to go into my dressing room, and I'll see you later." And we were backstage, and it was this small, narrow hallway, this corridor, and that was going to the stage. And his drummer comes out, and his bass player comes out. They all go towards the stage to start the show. And out of the dressing room comes Steve, and has his guitar around his neck. He's wearing platform shoes this big. He is in a black cape, and he has like a headband with laser beams.
That's the one. That's, I think, when I saw him.
And like a glass shield around his head. So here comes this huge alien, and I'm just looking at him. And I had seen him in jeans and a black T-shirt all day, and I'm just looking at him, and I don't say anything. I don't talk. I just watch him. And he sees my eyes. He sees the way I look at him, and he walks by and he says, "It pays the rent."
That's awesome. I think that's when I saw him. It might have been late 90s, early 2000s. That's so cool. No, he knows how to turn it on. He knows how to entertain.
Yeah. He says that I like to entertain. I'm a showman, and he does it so well. Besides all the amazing stuff that he's playing and writing, of course.
Absolutely. He's super talented. What was his relationship with Frank? Was it strictly working relationship, or did they become close friends?
Well, that I can say from firsthand, knowing Frank and having talked to Frank about Steve, and my appreciation for his work is that he really, really, really liked Steve a lot.
Yeah. You talked to Jimmy Carl Black, the first Mothers of Invention drummer, and you sent over another clip, and it's from an interview you did with Jimmy around 2005, 2006, and he's talking about Frank being a control freak, and this is in reference to the 1966 double album Freak Out. Can you talk about that? And also, Freak Out became a phrase thanks to Frank, right?
Yeah.
How was that conducted or improvised, or what was it?
Everything was conducted by him. Frank is a control freak. He really is a control freak. He doesn't really like to let things just happen. It's not like the Grateful Dead. They just let things happen. I mean, you can't really knock the dead. I mean, look how long they were together. A lot longer than the Mothers of Invention were together.
Mm-hmm. But like the It Can't Happen Here stuff, with the vocal stuff, did you get a chart for that, or how was that?
Well, yeah, he had it. He had a map laid out. Yeah, he knew how he wanted it done. And that's the way it was done, that way. He's the one that invented this word, freak out. That word was never used before in any context whatsoever until this record came out.
But was it a term that Vito used, that he copied, or did he really think of it?
I think Frank thought of it.
Because it is a truly addition to the English language.
It is, man, and it wasn't in the English language until this record came out 40 years ago, and now all these kids use it. I mean, man, he's freaking out. Freak out.
Is it true that this is the first double album in rock?
Yeah. Another double album that came out about the same time, although it wasn't in rock, was Bob Dylan. It was his folk stuff. This was the first rock double record. And it sold for $3.99. That was the retail price of that record when it came out.
You know, there's always discussion between music connoisseurs, which I'm not really, but some say that Freak Out was the first double album. Other people say it was Blonde on Blonde by Bob Dylan. But that is not really important. I mean, Jimmy was the original drummer of a band that Frank joined, which then later became the Mothers of Invention. And Jimmy always had, I've worked with him. He's been in my studio with a band from Liverpool called the Muffin Man. And I had done previous recordings with him. And I liked him. And he was a troubled guy. He had a beautiful wife, Monica. She still lives in Germany, where he spent the last years of his life. And they were very happy and when I was at their house with Menno, they were very, very kind. And but Jimmy always had a very mixed feelings because he loved Frank. He just loved Frank. And of course, he had to go through that rough time with the Mothers when the Mothers were disbanded, which was way before I knew Frank. But that's what I know from the stories from the guys from then and also from Frank's former manager, is that Frank just disbanded the Mothers because he couldn't take it anymore and financially. So they were all out of a job. And there's recorded material that Frank says, well, just go out on the road without me. And they said, no, Frank, we can't do that. I mean, because people come to see you, and that's it. And so that was for him, that was very hard. Now, a lot of people from those days, after the disbanding of the original Mothers of Invention, just badmouthed Frank all the time. Jimmy did not. He was always very confused, and then he would go really after Frank like he was so tough and blah, 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 blah. And then 1 minute later, he would be totally nostalgic about the whole thing. And he would say, I was in the best band in the world and stuff like that. So he was a mixed emotion guy. So it was interesting to talk to him. And he was, of course, a great drummer. In those days, he had his role, and he did that very well. And he was one of the few people from those days, from the very early Mothers, that would work with Frank later on. You had Roy Estrada, the bass player. He appeared on later Zappa albums. And then Jimmy appeared in the film 200 Motels and on later albums. So there was always this connection, you know. So it was a difficult relationship they had.
Was Frank always a perfectionist? Did he encourage any experimentation in the studio and on stage in later years? Both? Both.
But of course, he was a heavy taskmaster. I mean, he had an idea that he wanted to present, and people had to do their job, you know. And of course, in the beginning, he had to work with the material that was offered to him and that was available to him. You know, he had a band that knew very little about experimental music, very little about avant-garde music. They were all rhythm and blues oriented guys. And then when it became a little more successful, he had the opportunity to attract other people to the band, like trained musicians, like Don Preston, or a trained musician like Billy Mundy, Artie Tripp, the percussionist, especially Ian Underwood, of course, with who he made Hot Rats. So then more and more talented and great players became available to him. And so then all the level of the performances went up.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Frank & Co. Conversations with Frank Zappa, 1977 to 1993 is the book. And we're talking with the author, Kloet. And Co, you write in the book that you shared Frank's hatred of censorship. And my favorite clip of Frank is his appearance on CNN's Crossfire in 1986. It's a 2-on-1 assault. One is right-wing Washington Times columnist John Lofton, and he's going on about the offensive pornographic song lyrics of the time. The videos are offensive. What do you think about kids seeing this? And Frank does not back down. And you could see how much he enjoyed ruffling their feathers.
Mr. Zappa, let me see if I can get your position straight. Are you saying that there is no filth, no pornography, no obscenity that should not be permitted to be sold and distributed freely in this country in the form of music videos and rock music?
I don't think that music qualifies as pornography. And especially since this whole business started with words. We're talking about words here.
All right.
All the complaints were about words.
All right, take the pornography out there. Is there no filth, no obscenity that you think would qualify to be suppressed?
We're talking about words, and I don't believe that there is any word that needs to be suppressed. There's no scientific or realistic reason why you should keep people from hearing certain words.
Yeah, but Mr. Zappa, let me just follow that up. There are certain words you use that are to describe an act of fornication which are brutal.
So?
Well,
how about putting that on the radio? That's not permitted to be put on the radio. Do you think it should be?
Yes.
You think it should be on the radio?
Absolutely.
And on television?
Absolutely.
And
in politics.
I don't think I understand
because
that.
it's already in politics. I think that if you use the so-called strong words, you get your point across faster, and you can save a lot of beating around the bush. Well, why are people afraid of words?
Did he ever talk to you about that particular appearance?
He showed it to me, but then he showed me a lot of stuff when I was at the house that just baffled me. And he told me also stories about that subject that really baffled me. And some of that was fun to broadcast and fun to put in the book, you know. I mean, also, not only the politicians and the Tipper Gore type people, but also the TV evangelists and all the right wing Christian lobby groups that would say things that you just could not believe. I mean, he describes one guy who said that he found out that if you played the theme song for the old TV series Mr. Ed, the Talking Horse. You remember that show?
Oh, yeah. Where is this going? What do they think about this one?
Well, there was a religious person, and he said that if you played the theme song from Mr. Ed backwards, you would hear somebody say, Satan is the source. And Frank just said, what pastor has the time or even the idea to take the Mr. Ed theme song and play it backwards?
Unbelievable.
And there's more stuff like that, It's like they would say stuff like that, and he would just take it and make a song out of it. So that's why he put some things on his albums that were completely backwards. And just because people were trying to legislate it this way that you could not put backwards information. And he also I don't know if it was the same guy. And then Frank said that there was a guy who had found out that if you took the speeches of Bush Jr. about the Middle East and played them backwards, there was a woman's name. There was a secret code in there. And then Frank said it was a woman's name. And during the interview, he couldn't remember what it was. So when I packed up all my stuff, he says, oh, fuck, I remember. It was Simone. Yeah, he says somebody found out that in the backward, if you play the speeches of Bush about the Middle East backwards, you hear the name Simone, and that's a clue. That's a secret message. So what I did, I went home and I took my little editing system, and I just said Simone, and then I reversed it, and what I heard was enormous. So Bush probably said in one sentence, well, the reception was enormous. So people going to play that backwards, and they said, well, you had the word Simone. Hey, you said Simone.
Make sure you say enormous in your next speech. I mean,
so,
really.
And it's Frank just was so open about it, and he just would make fun of it, but he also would be really, really concerned about what it actually meant,
Yeah. No, he stood up to him. He was fearless. They're just words. They're words. Yeah. He keeps, I love it. The look on his face. They are words. You think they're just words?
One of the things that I like when the guy's really attacking him is this, oh yeah, how about kiss my ass?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's so great.
Do you think it is a good idea? Let's not say that the government's going to get in this all. Just as a matter of taste, of artistic preference, you think it's a good idea to write lyrics that says incest is good for you? Does that make any sense?
Well, it might make sense to Prince. That's his business, because that's mainly the song that they're talking about.
But don't you have an opinion on it?
My opinion is he's got a right to sing it, he's got a right to say it, and I got a right to not buy it.
Where does that right come from, Mr. Zappa? Where does the right to advocate incest come from?
That song does not advocate incest.
No, there are songs that advocate incest.
Tell me them. I haven't heard them.
Well, you ought to get out more. I don't think you're being candid with it. You know what those songs are. Now, you said there's a right to do this. Where does the right come from? Your group was called the Mothers of the Invention.
Mothers of Invention. You ought to get out more.
Yeah, and you're a very inventive guy. You make up a lot of stuff, like what was in the mind of the Founding Fathers. Would you look in the camera and tell them?
Which camera?
Any camera. And tell them.
Directing the show now?
Yeah, that's right. Well, you certainly need some direction, Mr. Zappa.
Want to spank me here? Come on, what are you trying to do?
Oh, you into that too, huh? No, I'm not into spanking.
I love it when you froth like that.
Sure. Now, would you tell our viewers that what the Founding Fathers...
I thought he was going to be the one frothing today. I'm glad that you're doing it.
Wrong again, Frank. Wrong again. Now,
I got a napkin for you when you drool.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Him too.
Now, would you look in the camera and tell them with a straight face that you think the Founding Fathers had in mind the kind of garbage you sing and write when they drafted the First Amendment? Do you really believe that, Mr. Zappa?
I don't think it applies. The Founding Fathers, for one thing, kept slaves, and take a look at what Benjamin Franklin used to do over at the Hellfire Club.
But you have repeatedly...
Not exactly a bunch of swell guys. I think they had some good things in mind, but we have a document, the letter of the law.
Yeah.
Let's use the letter of the law and interpret it based on the 20th century.
It is relevant because you have repeatedly, in opposing even ratings for rock music, you have repeatedly cited the Constitution and the First Amendment. Do you think the Founding Fathers really had the First Amendment, that they gave us the First Amendment to defend songs that glorify Satanism and incest and suicide? Do you really believe that?
Absolutely.
You really believe that?
Yeah, I believe it.
You're an idiot then. You're an idiot.
Well, I'll tell you what. Kiss my... How do you like that?
Take your teeth out. Take your teeth out and we'll talk business.
All right, fellas, let's call it off.
Come on, let's get really serious here. Come on, let's froth.
Frank sent me a whole package of stuff to use in my shows. There was something called the Z-Pack, which was his letter to Reagan and all kind of information about the Constitution, and also a big Humatic videotape of all his testimonies that he did in Washington. And you know, all the amount of time he would invest in something like that, and they weren't even going after him, you know.
No.
But he was so convinced that the freedom of speech was so important, and that people just didn't think. And it's now happening here in Holland, you know, because we have all these the people trying to find a balance in media between political correctness and be open. What can you say? What can you not say? You know, it's really a big item here, and I don't know how it is with you, but here
it's the big topic is Joe Rogan's podcast, and Neil Young pulled all of his songs off of Spotify because of the misinformation that Joe Rogan is putting out there with what he says and what his guests say, and there's that argument, freedom of speech. Let him say what he wants. We're smart enough to think for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a big topic right now. Some artists followed Neil Young's suit too. They're not happy with Joe Rogan and what he's saying. But again, how far do you take it? Freedom of speech. He can say what he wants, right? So
yeah.
You did mention the Turtles earlier. You shared a clip with the podcast of Flo and Eddie. That was a top 40 band that entered Frank's world early on, the Turtles. Howard Kalin and Mark Volman are their names, a.k.a. Flo and Eddie. And you talked with them in 1990. And this clip that you shared is of Howard telling the story of how they joined Frank's band, the Mothers of Invention.
Yeah, the Turtles had just broken up. I mean, literally 2 weeks earlier, we had a meeting, and we looked at the other guys in the band, and we just said, look, Mark and I can't do this anymore. Every time we were writing a song and bringing it to the Turtles, the rest of the members in the band would change the song around. That's how democratic we were. Everything was written as the Turtles. We produced as the Turtles. We had our own little company. We were trying very hard to be the Beatles. So while the Beatles had Apple, the Turtles had Blimp. And we would sign artists. We almost opened up a boutique on Sunset Boulevard for our wives to design clothes. I mean, it was really sick. We were very, very sick. So when Frank came along with this opportunity, he had heard through the Hollywood grapevine that the Turtles had broken up. We didn't know what we were going to do. When the band broke up, we called our lawyer and we said, we just broke up the Turtles, and our lawyer said, you guys are idiots. you're idiots because now you can't use the name Turtles to record. You can't use the name Mark and Howard to record. You can't do anything. And so we were really depressed. We didn't know what to do. We were offered the West Coast lead parts in the Broadway production of Hair. We almost took it. I can't imagine how scary my life would be if we'd have gone into Hair.
Yeah.
But instead, we went to see Frank Zappa and Zubin Mehta and the LA Philharmonic do the previews to 200 Motels at UCLA's Poly Pavilion. And it was a very nice program, and after the show we went backstage to shake hands with Frank and the members of the original Mothers that Frank had gotten together. And Frank said, "Hey, I hear the Turtles broke up." We said, "Wow, that was quick." Yes, we did. We broke up about 2 weeks ago, and he said, "I'm putting a new band of Mothers together. We're going to go to Europe. We're going to do this special in Holland." That was the first thing we were scheduled to do. And he said, "And also we're going to play a bunch of shows, and then we are going to make a movie. Are you interested?" And we said, "Yes, absolutely interested." And he said, "Do you play instruments?" We said, "Yes." We both played saxophones at the time. And he said, "Well, I'm having a barbecue on Sunday. Why don't you come on over and bring your saxophones, and we'll have a little audition." So Sunday rolled around. We went over to Frank's house. We couldn't figure out why he wanted us to bring our saxophones. We knew he had Ian Underwood in the band. He was the best saxophone player we'd ever heard in our lives. But instead, he brought us, during the course of the barbecue, down to the basement. We took out our saxophones. We honked around a little bit. We did this audition. And after we played a little bit, Frank just said, "Yeah, that's real good, you guys. Okay, put away the saxophones, put them away. Let's just try singing for a little while." And that worked out really well.
They ended up recording just a couple studio albums with Frank, right? It was very brief, their time with Frank?
Yeah, because he got the accident in London. They were, I think, the first album they appeared on was Chunga's Revenge. Of course, they were vital in 200 Motels, the movie and the album. And then there were two infamous live albums, Live at the Fillmore East and Live, and Just Another Band from LA. And that was about it. And of course, now the Zappa Family Trust is putting out more stuff of those days and concerts, and they're going to do a whole package of that era. And of course, they were such a surprise to everybody that Frank, after the Mothers of Invention, which was very instrumental oriented, very serious, very heavy, very avant-garde, then came up with Flo and Eddie. And there was another turtle in the band for a while called Jim Pons, the bass player, and they were such an influence on him, and they got along so well, and they were for a lot of people, they were so vital for that period. It was like a vaudeville band almost, but of course with great music. But the way they sang was unprecedented in pop music. I mean, it was like incredible what they did.
Now, the chapter titled 1989, by the way, this is when you first learned of Frank's cancer diagnosis. He just,
Yes.
by the way, to you.
Yeah, called me up about something, and because we had quite some phone contact, which was not all recorded. But he wanted me to do something. I can't exactly remember why we talked about it. He was planning to come to Holland for a convention, and then we were talking about some stuff. And then at the end of the conversation, he says, "Oh, by the way, I got cancer." And I can't. I said, "Can it be cured?" He said, "We'll see. We'll see what happens." So this was already so that means that when I did the big supplement birthday special in 1990. I already knew that he was ill. I shared some very personal stories in the book because I think they were more describing how wonderful a person he was, rather than I tried to stay away from gossip, because there was a lot of gossip around Frank, and still is, and people have an opinion about him or try to paint a certain picture of him. And that's what all great names in history, that's their faith. People will try and make their version of that person. And that's why I say in the beginning of my book that this does not pretend to be anything but a personal memory. And I don't want to bore people with my opinions or whatever. This is just what happened to me in relationship to Frank. And the way I built up the book is that the personal memories are just things that I know and I took notes of, and I have a very good memory because being a Zappa fan, I didn't take drugs when I was young. And all the conversations in the book I have on audio. So everything is literally on tape. What you read is what I have on audio. So nobody can ever tell me they could never have said that, So, well, here's the tape.
Yeah. Publicly, his life was, like you write in the book, shrouded in mystery from 89 to 93.
Yeah.
And there's an emotional story you share about seeing him in the summer of 1993. Fans can read that story in the book, but that was the last time you ever saw him?
Yes, because he died in December.
Yeah, December 4th of 93. Your phone rings and you get the news that Frank had passed. What do you remember most about Frank Zappa when someone mentions his name? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Well, it's still baffling that I've had such a long time relationship with him. Obviously, a lot of people knew him perhaps much better than I did, because they were in the band or they were working for him or his family for that matter. But I covered a long time, I got my first radio interview was in 1973. And this is almost 50 years later. And I've known him very well. And the only thing that pisses me off is people trying to describe him in a certain way that, like he was a heavy taskmaster and he was a tyrant
acerbic.
And he was this and he was that, stuff like that. To me, he was always supportive, extremely interested in what I was doing, and extremely kind. And of course he could be tough. Of course he could be, weird. And of course he had some things that I would not have liked if my father had behaved that way. But I mean, that was his life. I mean, that's none of my business,
And he's human. That's the thing people forget about these big rock stars. They are human beings. They are flawed, just like you and I.
Yeah. And he liked women.
He had 4 children, right? Moon, Dweezil, Amit, and Diva.
That's right.
Yeah. Do you talk to the children? I know you talk to Dweezil, but the other children
I talk to Dweezil.
Yeah.
Dweezil is a great person. I did a great project with him with an orchestra. I plan to do more stuff with him, and we really get along. He's an extremely nice guy, and his band that he has now, he started that ZPC thing way back, and in the beginning it was fantastic because Bowie was there and Brock and Vi, and it was just a great experience. But he has matured, and he has now reached a level of performance and insight in his father's music, which is absolutely amazing. One of the albums that I really love for personal reasons is standing there behind me. It's called Ship Arriving Too Late to Save a Drowning Witch. The song Drowning Witch was on the repertoire with the Vi band. And I had very great memories of it. The last band that Dweezil had was playing here in Amsterdam, and they played that song, and I just could not believe it, how good it was. It was amazing. It was the spirit of Frank's music, perfectly reflected. Deep respect for Dweezil in doing that.
And he's got talent of his own for sure. He can
perform.
Yeah. I recommend for any Van Halen fan listening, check out his podcast, Running with the Dweezil. He's got a bunch of great guests. He had Stevie Vai on his show, and
another thing you should check out is we commissioned him to write a piece for orchestra, and that is great. We did a project with him called it was a bit of a not a joke, but it was a bit of a, how do you call it in English, like a wink wink, like a tongue in cheek. Yeah. I used a Zappa title,
like a parody, almost like a parody, or a
but a serious parody. I had a whole evening with the orchestra, with a beautiful orchestra, Dweezil as a guest, together with his bass player and orchestrator Kurt Morgan, another great person, and we did 2 sold out shows with the North Netherlands Orchestra, who also worked with me with Steve Vai and Todd Rundgren. And Dweezil did a great evening with them, played with them, and we had his piece performed, his first big classical composition. And I named that evening Dweezil Zappa's Orchestral Favorites. because that's the title of one of Frank's albums, Zappa's Orchestral Favorites. So that was fun.
Beautiful. Before I ask you what your favorite Zappa song is, your daughter, is it pronounced Jasmine Ziva?
Yeah.
I got it right. Jasmine has some favorite Zappa songs. Cheap Thrills, Electric Aunt Jemima, Baby Snakes, Goblin Girl, and The Handsome Cabin Boy. Is there a particular Frank Zappa song that connects with you the most? Not necessarily maybe the most favorite, but one that really connects with you the most, and why?
It's a cliche, but I think that what I really think is fantastic is the finale song of Turn of Motels called Strictly Genteel. And one of the most baffling pieces, I still think, is the song called Peaches and Regalia, the opening of Hot Rats.
Yes.
That's a classic. And then again, there's what Frank could do is that he could be very weird, extravagant, but also he has a very, very melodic and even romantic side to him. And there's certain, like the song Duke of Prunes from his second album, which was actually a theme used in the film music he wrote before he had the Mothers. Just that melody, his melodic concept is so strong. That's what connects him with Steve Vai. They have a melodic / harmonic climate, as Frank called it, that is unique to their personality. And of course, they have their influences, but the way they reuse the influences and make them their own is something that connects Steve Vai and Frank Zappa for me in a strong way. And Zappa could just write a melody that you think, what? How can you think of that? That is so great. And there's some songs that you like less, but certain songs that just stick to you. And I would say Strictly Genteel and Peaches and Regalia are two classics for me.
What's so beautiful, too, is there are artists like Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain. They were gone so young, and so there isn't that huge body of work. Frank Zappa, this is just a quick look on Wikipedia. 62 albums during his lifetime. Posthumous albums, 57. So a total of 119 albums. So there's plenty there for people to go back and listen to. And just see how his music changes over time, how he evolves, the things he does. I am going to give you my favorite Zappa song, and it ties in with my question. I absolutely love Willie the Pimp. Absolutely love that song. And this leads to my question about Captain Beefheart, because he's the one that is on vocals here. It is fitting that the book ends with an interview with the late, great Don van Vliet, a.k.a. Captain Beefheart. You call him a phenomenon in the book. He leaves music in 1982 to focus on painting. This was the last interview of any length that he ever did, and it was with you. It was in 2008, 2 years before he passed away, and you cover quite a bit of ground there. What stands out to you most about this interview?
Well, I've met him before, and I have recorded his last show in Amsterdam for the radio. And through him, I got to be friends with his then manager and guitar player, who was actually the man behind Jeff Buckley, Mr. Gary Lucas, who I am deeply grateful to, because he introduced me to Jawbone Press. And Gary Lucas and I still do stuff together, but that's another story. And I had already seen Beefheart live a few times, and I met him in 1980, and we stayed in contact. And then when I did a big Captain Beefheart special, I did a telephone interview with him. And that was his last lengthy interview, because then he withdrew from public life because he was ill. And, the relationship Zappa Beefheart is a book in itself, because they grew up together, they went to high school together, they listened to music together, and their cooperation has always been extremely weird and interesting, because of course Frank became big and financially well-to-do and stuff like that, and Beefheart was always more like a niche and experimental guy, but he could always rely on Frank. When he was in trouble, he would go to Frank, and they would like each other and love each other, and in public they would say bad things about each other. So it's extremely interesting. So, and I was trying in that interview to get him to talk about that subject. So I did this little association game that you do when you have a lot of time to talk to people. So I would give him one word and he should talk about it. And so I put in Frank Zappa in there, So, okay, and now you can do your story. So I said, okay, the next word is Frank Zappa. And he was silent for a bit, and then he says, he's the only Frank Zappa I know. So that was the cue for me. Okay, next word.
Yeah, you can take that however you wish, but next question. Yeah. Frank and Co., Conversations with Frank Zappa, 1977 and 1993, is out now, I would say, by the time this episode runs. It's through Jawbone Press. It's available wherever books are sold. Is there any website that you want people to go to get the book, or is it the usual Amazon outlet?
Yeah, and of course the jawbonepress.com is a great website also for the other books, and but it's available everywhere.
Social media pages, and you want to let people know about?
Well, you can follow me on Instagram. If you just type in my name, you'll see it. And you'll see my nickname that I got from Mike Keneally's manager, called Creative Catalyst. That's the job description I've been using for the past 20 years. So I don't use up too much time to explain what I do, because that's basically what I do. I try to be a creative catalyst.
We'll put the link up to Jawbone, to the Amazon link, and to the Instagram page and the show notes page. Well, Cole, thanks so much for a great interview, a great book, and thanks so much for sharing the audio of your interviews with Frank and Flo and Eddie and Jimmy Carl Black. This was a real treat.
Thank you so much for your support. I'm very appreciative of the time that you have reserved for me and the time that you were willing to spend with me to talk about this.
All right, Cole.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to Kloet for taking us through his book, Frank and Co., Conversations with Frank Zappa, 1977 to 1993. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just Co., but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore is on our website, bookedonrock.com. Make sure you subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We're on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/BookedOnRockPodcast. On Twitter at BookedOnRock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. If you're a publisher or author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, send me an email or contact me through our website, bookedonrock.com. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening, and join me again next time for another episode of Booked on Rock.